Looking back at the United Nations Financing for Development Conference in Monterey in 2002, looking back to Glen Eagles in 2005, and I was Chief Economist at the World Bank at Monterey in 2002, and I led the writing of the report to the Commission for Africa in 2005, which was led up to Glen Eagles. And I can tell you with some authority that we did not take climate change seriously enough in either of those two discussions. The financing challenges that we looked at, big though they were, should have come up with bigger estimates if we had taken climate change properly into account. Now let's just pick up on what Ed Miliband expressed so clearly, which is where we're headed. We start at a little above 430 parts per million, the CO2 equivalent, by adding 2.5 parts per million a year, and that's rising. 100 years of that would see that 430-something where we are now increase to something like 750 parts per million, and that would give us more than a 50-50 chance sometime early next century of being above 5 degrees centigrade, above pre-industrial times. That is just enormous. As Ed said, it's 30 to 50 million years since we've been at that level. We would see many parts of the world, including southern Europe, turn into a desert. We would see many areas inundated. We would see many areas subject to hurricanes. We would see agriculture devastated in many parts of the world. And hundreds of millions, probably billions of people would have to move as the coast changes, as the flows and patterns of the rivers change, as the weather changes and the climate more fundamentally in terms of its long-term trend. We would see massive migration. People would have to move. They're already moving in some parts of the world, including in Darfur. But at that scale, billions of people would move, and that would create protracted world conflict. We have to be very clear about the stakes that we're playing for. On the other hand, if we handle it well, and I'll try to describe that briefly, if we handle it well, we can dramatically reduce the odds of those kinds of temperature increases. We're going to have to handle some, and it's going to be substantial and difficult, but we can dramatically reduce the odds of that kind of catastrophe. And we can do it for a cost of 1 or 2% of world GDP. That's like a one-off 1 or 2% increase in a cost index. It is significant resources, important amounts of resources are involved, but that kind of reduction in danger that it would bring would be well worth the money. Now, I've described this already as a flow-stock process. The flows each year build up into the stocks and it goes on rising. It's very important to constantly remind ourselves of that because it tells us a number of messages. Two of those are that delay is very costly. The longer you delay, the more the flows build up into the stocks, the more the stocks rise, and the more difficult your starting position for action. This is not like a WTO negotiation where you can pick up after 5 years roughly where you were before. If you do that, try to do that with climate change, you start at a much worse position. That flow stock process also says we have to look at history and how the concentrations got to be of the levels they are, and that tells us that the rich countries, through their process of high carbon growth, are responsible for a substantial majority of the concentrations that are there now. And that's why Martinez von Schultwig, our Brazilian friends, our Indian friends, are constantly reminding us, and rightly so, of the inequities of this position. But what do we have to do? Well, if we want to hold the concentrations in the atmosphere below 500 parts per million, and then bring it on down from there, that will take a very long time, but then bring it on down from there, we're going to have to cut global emissions by at least 50% by 2050. That will mean that the 40 gigatons of flows and emissions of 1990, and it's all relative to 1990 high percentage reductions, that cutting by 50% means 40 gigatons in 1990 has to become 20 gigatons by 2050. There'll be roughly 9 billion people in 2050, and remember that giga is the same as billions. Scientists use giga, economists use billions. 20 gigatons divided by around 9 billion people will be a little over 2 tons per capita by 2050. That's where we've got to be. The United States is over 20, most of Europe between 10 and 13. We've got to get our 10 on 13 into Europe, We've got to get that down to close to 2. That's divided by 5. That's why we talk about 80%. These are not numbers conjured out of the air. They follow directly from the basic science that's telling us what we have to do. So we know roughly the scale of the action we need to make as a world, and we also know roughly where we have to act. It's about energy efficiency. It's about low carbon energy. It's about stopping deforestation. Those are the big things, big areas where we have to act. And we know more than that. We know something of the economic policies that can take us there. A price for carbon being absolutely fundamental. This is the greatest externality the world has ever seen. It arises from not pricing, not charging people for the damage they do when they emit. So part of the story has to be to fix the market. Not abandon the market, fix the market when it fails. We're going to have to use regulation as well. We're going to have to promote low carbon technologies with direct actions to promote technologies. And we're going to have to stop, as I said, deforestation. So we can see and we can talk about the kind of policies necessary to do that. So we can see the policy story. So we can see the scale, we can see how we have to act, and we can see the policy instruments that can promote that kind of action. What we need now is political will. And the global deal in Copenhagen is the way we have to embody that political will, and we have to build that up during these short months that remain between now and the beginning of December. Now, in my last few moments, let me say something about this economic crisis. One thing we should learn from this economic crisis, if we haven't learned it already, I really hope we have, and that is that if we ignore risk, if we postpone action on risk, if we underestimate risk, it will just get bigger and bigger. That's what happened to us in this economic crisis, and we have to recognise, deep and serious though this economic crisis is, the planetary crisis which we face is still more troublesome, still more difficult, and still much, much longer lasting than the one we described, and the effects and damages it causes could be irreparable. The second thing we should learn is that we must grow out of this recession. Growing out of the recession means laying the foundations for strong, long-term, sustainable growth. The big growth opportunities of the next 2 or 3 decades will be in the low-carbon technologies. This is a story which is similar or bigger than the railways, electricity, the motor car, IT. This is something that can sustain the growth of the world for an extended period in a very attractive way. As we come out of this recession, we must lay the foundations for that, and not as we came out of the dot-com bubble in a way that laid the foundation for the housing bubble, which burst with such devastating consequences around us. So let's think of the story of long-term growth, and let's be investing now to get there. And there's so much we can do when resources are cheap during a recession to lay those foundations. But finally, let me finish with an air of optimism, at least an air of what we can do if we're sensible in 2009. In 2009, we could have a real coordination of our economic response to the economic crisis. That would be very powerful, and it would be a first in economic collaboration. We could complete the WTO and bring trade back to the centre of the agenda where it should be. We could and we must get a strong agreement in Copenhagen, and we could recommit to the Millennium Development Goals in the recognition of how much more difficult they have become in the context of a changing climate. If we did all those things in 2009, it would be a fantastic year for the world. Thank you.